Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf lamed hey. We're going to continue deep into the laws of pigul, and I want to just get started with the bottom of lamed dalet. So before we get back into pigul, we're on a side. We've gone off on a sidetrack because we were talking about the submission and all sorts of things that don't actually disqualify the korban, that were kind of done a little incorrectly. We talked about why things aren't dahui, kind of rejected, and we explained that if something is in the power of the person to fix, then it's not considered dahui. And then for proof, we brought Rabbi Yehuda, this bright of Rabbi Yehuda. What would they do on Pesach? They would fill up a cup of blood from the ground. They would pour it on the altar, and that way, in case blood had spilled from the sacrifices and someone's korban, the blood didn't make it to the altar, this would kind of cover them. So now we're going to go in depth into that brighta. So again, you said we'll start from the very bottom of Lamed Dalet Amud Bet. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kos echad hayam memalei midam ha'tarovet. He would fill up a cup from the blood mixed up on the floor. She'im yishafech echad mehem nimtza shu machshiro, that in case the blood of one of the korbanot would get spilled, he would fix it. Amru lo Rabbi Yehuda, the rabbis didn't agree with this at all. The rabbis said to him, v'alo lo niskabel b'kli, but it wasn't accepted in a vessel. Remember, we learned that if the blood goes straight onto the floor without going into the vessel first, can't use it. So, to which he said, Minayade, how do we know that it wasn't accepted in a kli? Ella, now this is the Gemara kind of, this isn't the rabbis of Rabbi Yehuda anymore, it's the Gemara saying, what do you mean? Maybe, right, how do we know it wasn't accepted in a kli? So they say, no, maybe the question they were asking was, Ella shema lo nitkabel b'kli. Maybe, in other words, you don't know what this blood on the floor is from, maybe it wasn't accepted in a vessel first. That's the concern, not that we know it wasn't, but maybe it wasn't. So Amar Lahen, now back to his response, Afani lo amarti ela kishenit nitkabel b'kli. I was talking about blood that was accepted in a vessel. Now, this doesn't really resolve the problem because, right, hu gufei minayada. In other words, how do you know when you see all this blood on the floor in the temple? How do you know that it was all accepted in a vessel first? Maybe some of it didn't. So he answers no. It's obvious that it was all accepted in a vessel first because kohanim is rizim. The kohanim are zrizim. What does that mean, they're zrizim? It means they take their job very seriously. Okay, zrizim also, we always say zrizim makdim mitzvot. They come early, they rush to get things done. So the kohanim are they're very fastidious about what they do. So the kohanim, for sure, are there when they sacrifice the korbanot and for sure collected the blood. You can assume that. Well, if you can assume that, then why do we think there's blood on the floor? Do we think the kohanim are careful about that as well? Well, Avdin haya umishtabchim. Well, because the kohanim are so excited about getting their job done, sometimes they rush to the altar. Now think about it. When you run carrying a cup of water, what happens? The water spills. So if the kohanim, while on the one hand they're diligent and they come and they collect the blood for sure, that we can assume. But then the concern is that they spill it on the way because they're so anxious to get to the altar. And that's why we can assume the blood went into the vessel first. However, we're concerned that it fell on the floor. Now we have this problem, okay? Because now, what blood is on the floor? Now, first of all, why is there even blood on the floor? Isn't there this channel in the temple, if you remember, or maybe you don't remember, but there's this kind of channel in the tunnel where the blood spills out and it goes all the way, or anything that spills basically, water, blood, whatever is on the ground goes out and goes into Nachal Kidron. Okay, it leaves the temple. Now, what happens is, on Pesach, and we're going to see this in another minute, just so you understand why there's blood here on the floor and how we can collect it, they put a stopper in the drain and all the blood collects in any blood that's spilled. Now, what blood spills on the floor? Well, number one, you're going to have blood that we just talked about. The kohanim in their excitement to get things done. And yes, Miriam, I mentioned this in the previous, in the Hebrew, I forgot to mention it here, which is, it reminds us of the kohanim actually killing each other because they're so excited to do their job, right? Sometimes excitement is not necessarily always a good thing. In this case, it's both a good thing and also potentially a dangerous thing because all the blood can spill and it's an issue. Then it won't fulfill the sacrifices because they didn't get the blood on the altar, which Rabbi Yehuda comes up with this great solution. Now, the problem with this solution, and what we're going to do in the rest of this sugya, is we're going to talk about issues with Rabbi Yehuda's position, which we already started asking some questions. We're going to add more now. And then we're going to have to explain, because everyone agrees they stopped up the blood. Now, if the rabbis don't think that they could carry this blood to the altar and put it on the altar, then why did they put the plug in the drain, according to the rabbis? And then we're going to have an answer for that, and then we're going to have difficulties on that as well. So the problem here is, what's the main source of blood that's on the floor of the temple right now? It's all the blood that comes out from the neck of the animal after the blood was collected. That, if you remember, there's the hanefesh, which is the blood where it's called the lifeblood, where the blood that, as you saw the animal, that's the blood that spurts out. That's the blood we bring on the altar and it was collected, and maybe some of it spilled on the ground. But the blood that's left in the animal after is called the hatamtzit. Now that blood is not generally brought on the altar, and that's the blood. It's not collected in the cup, and it's not, right? Most of the blood on the floor is made up of that, because most of the blood wasn't from spilled blood from the cups. So the Gemara asks, "V'lo hatamtzit mu'rav bo," and the main issue seems to be that if the majority is hatamtzit, it's going to nullify the blood of the sacrifices that we need, the hanefesh. And if it nullifies it, then when we bring it on the altar, it's like we brought hatamtzit and not hanefesh, and then it won't fulfill any obligation because the blood was nullified. So they say, Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei da'amal hatamtzit kari dam. See, Rabbi Yehuda actually goes according to his own opinion, which is that hatamtzit is blood. It's like the lifeblood of the animal. How do we know this? Tanya, well, actually, they're going to quote it from a totally different sugya. Well, I say totally different. It's not exactly totally different, but what? The blood, okay, just like chaylev, you can't have chaylev of animals and you can't eat the blood of the animals. Now, there's different reasons why, but it seems one of the main reasons is because chaylev are the parts that get sacrificed on the altar. So in a regular animal, when it's not a sacrificial animal, you're actually not allowed to eat those parts. And the blood also gets poured on the altar, and therefore you're not allowed to eat the blood. Now, there's other reasons why you can't eat the blood of the animal, because that's the life of the animal. But anyway, the question is, if you say that the blood of the animal that's forbidden is just the lifeblood, then hatamtzit is completely different. But if you say that hatamtzit is also included in the prohibition to drink the blood of an animal, then you basically treat hatamtzit like hanefesh, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda does. So therefore, the hatamtzit doesn't nullify the hanefesh, because the hatamtzit could be brought on the altar as well. It's the same thing, or kind of the same thing, although we'll see it's not really, but right now we're going to think it is. Tanya hatamtzit ba'azara. So according to this Braita, the one who disagrees with the Rabbi Yehuda Tanakama says, you can't eat the hatamtzit of an animal. It's prohibited, but just as a warning. Okay? If you eat blood or drink blood, it's karet, but not the hatamtzit. It's just a lotasit. Don't do it, but it's not the same as the blood of the soul, the lifeblood of the animal. Rabbi Yehuda omer b'karet. Rabbi Yehuda says the hatamtzit, you get karet for it, it's the same. So therefore we think that according to him, the hatamtzit is the same as hanefesh, basically. Also, now there it was talking about the prohibition to eat blood of an animal, of a regular non-sacrificial animal, but we assume that it's the same thing he would say for the sacrifice, to which the Gemara says, that's not true. V'hama Rabbi Elazar. Okay, Rabbi Elazar, the Emora. Okay, he comes later. He's an Eretz Israeli Emora. Okay, we're going to see him. He's going to play a central role in the next sugya from the next Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar said, Modeh Rabbi Yehuda l'inyan kapara she'ino mechaper. Shene'amar ki adam hu b'nefesh yichaper. Okay, they quoted the wrong pasuk here by accident. The printer, whoever copied this, they copied the other pasuk. But it's ki adam hu b'nefesh yichaper. When it comes to atonement for the sacrifices, it says the dam hu b'nefesh yichaper. It's going to atone from the soul. So it's the hanefesh for atonement purposes. Even though Rabbi Yehuda thinks the hatamtzit is forbidden for eating, when it comes to sacrifices, it's not brought on the altar. It's not going to atone for you. So if the hatamtzit nullifies the hanefesh, well, it's not going to help if you bring that on the altar, because you're basically bringing hatamtzit, and that doesn't provide atonement because it's nullified, the hanefesh. Now, so they say, right? So, ki adamu b'nefesh yichapel. This is just continuing that line. Dam sha'nefesh yotzabo karoi dam. She'en ha'nefesh yotzabo ein karoi dam. So again, the dam that the soul leaves the body, the lifeblood, that's called dam, but not the, right? If it's not that blood, it's not called dam for the purposes of atonement. I see you're asking the Korban Pesach isn't really atonement, but it is for acceptance of a Korban. The word atonement is used very loosely. We've seen this actually a bunch of times in our Masechet. It really just means for the Korban to be accepted. Okay, even though the majority of Korbanot do atone, so therefore they use it as a general term. But now they say, and this is something that you mentioned in the chat, Miriam, before, and now it comes up in the Sugya. I didn't address it then because it comes up right now. They say, so how do we explain this issue? And what's our problem now? The dam hatamtzit nullifies the dam hanefesh. So what do they answer? Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei damar ein dam mevatel dam. Well, he holds blood doesn't nullify blood. Why is that? Because it's min bimino, the same type. In fact, the whole source for min bimino not nullifying comes from blood. If you remember, the dama par and the dama seir on Yom Kippur, that we mix the bloods, and the dama par, the bull blood is obviously there's more blood from the bull than there is from a smaller animal, from the goat. So, and yet we mix the bloods together and then we sprinkle them, the achad, v'shtayim, right? That's a mix of bloods. And there you see the dam doesn't mevatel the dam. So, ein dam mevatel dam, and that's why this works. Okay, so now we've resolved Rabbi Yehuda and all the issues we have with his opinion. Amar lahem Rabbi Yehuda, now to the rabbis. L'divrechem lama pokekin Azara. What's the purpose of putting this stopper in the drain of the Azara then? In other words, they all agree that this happened. So the question is, why would they do it? Amru lo, because if you're not trying to collect the blood, then what purpose would you do it? In fact, it makes a huge mess. You have blood, piling up in the Azara. So if there's some really important reason, we could see. But if there's no point to do it, then why would they do it? Amru lo, shevachu lebnei Aaron she'alchu adar kuvotehem badam. It's praise for the sons of Aaron that they go up to their knees in blood. Okay, what does this mean? There's a bunch of different interpretations. We'll go with one. Right? It's kind of disgusting to walk up to your knees in blood, and it's a shevach to the Bnei Aaron that they're willing to do their avoda, even when they're soaked in blood up to their knees. It shows how much they're excited about their job, that they're willing to do, even if it requires doing something kind of unpleasant, they're willing to do it anyway. That's a possibility. There's a bunch of different possibilities, but I don't want to harp on it today. So now they say, okay, but there's some problems with this opinion. Hadam habe chatzitza. The dam creates a chatzitza. Now, the truth is, it's a problem according to Rabbi Yehuda as well. But since we had other issues with him, right, so here they raise an issue with them. It's a chatzitza. It's an interposition between their feet and the ground. You're not allowed to step on anything. Remember, we talked about that. So they say, la have v'lo have chatzitza. It's a liquid. Liquids don't create interpositions here. Ditnan, how do we know? Hadam v'adyo v'advash v'chalav. Okay, they talk about four things: blood, ink, honey, and milk, that all could theoretically be hardened. Okay, yiveshim chotzitzim, lachin ein chotzitzim. When they're liquids, they don't create an interposition. Right? Think about it. If you're touching the floor and there's water on the floor, you're really still touching the floor. But if you're stepping on a piece of bread, you're really not touching the floor. So if something is hard, it's a chatzitza. If something's liquidy, it's not. Okay, so we resolved the first question, but now they have a different question, which goes back to something we saw earlier in the Masechet. But now their clothes are all dirty if the kohanim are up to their knees in blood. And their pants, if you remember, go down to the floor. Then the bottom part of their pants are filthy. Vitnan, and it says in the Mishnah, remember this? If their clothes are dirty and they did the avoda, their avoda is disqualified. So now you're at a catch-22. Doesn't work, right? So, catch-21, I don't know why. When I go so fast, I can't remember what I'm saying. Anyway, you're at a catch-21, and we don't know what to do here, okay? Or 22, I don't even know anymore. Yeah, catch-22, I guess I said it right. Sounding wrong. Okay, so, Tanan. So now we have this problem. If you're going to, we want to show the shevach, we have a problem. If you want to show but then we have a different problem that their clothes are going to be filthy. Right, now if you remember, they could lift up their pants, or maybe they can, maybe they can't, right? They can't lift up their pants, right? Maybe they'll lift them up, but Hatanya, it says in a Braita, mido kim midato, okay, the length, it has to be exactly its length. Shelo yechasel v'shelo yotil. Can't be, has to be exactly the right length. You can't make it shorter or make it longer, right? Pick it up. So that doesn't work. So now we're really stuck. So the answer, well, it's not going to be while they're doing the avoda. Okay, while they're doing the avoda, they're not going to have they're not going to be into their knees in blood. It's only b'holachat evarim lakevish. It's when they bring the parts of the animal that need to go to the ramp, then while they're walking them, they get then into their knees in blood, and then they can pick up their pants. Why? Because delav avodahi. That's not part of the central part of the avoda. So there they could be without their pants being the right length. To which, okay, we're going to have a few issues here. You might already be thinking of some. So first they say v'lo v'hatan yavi kriva kohen et hakol. So this pasuk that says the kohen brings everything. So what does that mean? That means bringing the parts to the altar. And it says you need a kohen. And if it says you need a kohen, what do we learn? That means the clothes have to be on the kohen. So that doesn't work. It might not be one of the 4 central parts of the avodah, but it is a central part. That doesn't work. And it's enough that kohen has to be with his clothes proper at that point. Ela b'holachat itzim lamaracha delav avodahi. So they say it must be when they're bringing the wood to the altar that you need for the burning. That's not an avoda. That's just a thing that has to happen, which is the wood has to be brought to the altar and the kohanim do it. That's when they'll be up to their knees in blood. And that will show this shevach that they're willing to do that. So now obviously the main problem is if we put this plug in and there's blood everywhere, how are they doing the rest of the avodah? So it might be just while they bring the wood, they're up to their knees and they basically pull up their pants so they don't get dirty. But how are they doing the rest of the avodah? How do they walk to? We know you have to walk in the temple to take the blood from there to the other place to go bring your klei sharet up to where the animal's being slaughtered. And there's blood everywhere. How do they do that? They put platforms and the kohanim walk on the platforms. So basically, when they're doing the avodot, they're off the ground. But at one point, when they bring the wood, right, that's when they go into their knees in blood, and that's when they pick up the pants, and now we have a resolution. It's quite complicated, and maybe that explains why the blood would spill more so, because it's not so easy to be up walking on these platforms, but that's how they would do it according to the rabbi's position. According to Rabbi Yehuda, right, we don't really talk about what, maybe just the whole thing is done on platforms and that's, resolves it. Okay. That's it for the first section for today. Now we're getting back into pigul. Okay? That's a good question. Why doesn't the Itztiba create a chatzitza? I guess they made them so Rashi says, Enam chotzitzim demina ritzpahin. Rashi says these are kind of considered part of the floor. Okay? A chatzitza is something, right? This is like an extension of the floor. That's how you would have to see it. Okay, Mishnah. This is a Mishnah that kind of repeats things that we saw in the past and yet adds other things that we didn't see in the past. So, a shochet et hazevach le'echol davar she'en darko le'echol u'laktir davar she'en darko la'aktir kasher. Okay, this we saw already, that if you slaughter a zevach with an intent, okay, we're back, deep into pigul. Okay, Daf Mishalehen this week is about pigul. So there's a bunch of shiurim about this topic because it's really a central topic in this whole Masechet, and certainly the beginning of our Masechet, which focuses a lot on it. So you're slaughtering a zevach with the intent that you're going to eat davar. Okay, just to remember, I keep repeating this, but I think pigul is just a hard concept to get our heads around, so let's repeat everything so we have it clear, or repeat a bunch of things. Pigul is a thought that you're having, okay? It comes from the words ha'achol ya'achel, right? So it's got this double language, which one achila is talking about eating, and one is about burning, or putting blood on the altar, something going on the altar. So if you have a thought to eat something that's generally eaten, or to put something on the altar that's generally put on the altar, and that you're going to do it in the wrong time, okay, meaning tomorrow or any time after tomorrow, or you're going to eat it beyond its designated time, which might not even be tomorrow, depending on if it's a shlamim, it'll be on the third day. Okay, and if you have that thought, or chutzim komo, remember is pigul, but there's no karet, so it disqualifies the korban, but there isn't karet. But there is karet if you have a pigul machshava of chutzas mano. Where do you get karet? Not for doing the pigul thought. The karet is when you eat the meat. Okay, you eat the animal. Today we're going to talk about which parts of the animal. Okay, so if you slaughter a zevach while you're slaughtering it, it could be also while you're doing kabbalat adam, while you're doing holacha, while you're doing zrika, with the thought to eat, davar she'en darko le'echol la'aktir, davar she'en darko la'aktir. Now they skip the main thing, which is chutz lizmano, okay, or chutzim komo, kasher. It's not pigul, because it has to be eating something that generally gets eaten and burning something that generally gets burnt. But if it's to eat something that's supposed to be burned on the altar, or to put something on the altar that's supposed to be eaten, that doesn't make a pigul. Rabbi Eliezer Posel, he says, no, that's also disqualified, because there's he'achol yachel double language, and you can learn from one to the other, and it could be a thought about the parts that are supposed to be burned, I'm going to eat them tomorrow. That's also an issue. Okay, so it could be either which way. So now when it is the right way of pigul, well, it has to be more than kazayit. These are all basically exceptions to the rule. If you have a thought that I'm going to eat less than an olive oak's worth outside the time, then it's going to be fine. It's not pigul, and the korban's not disqualified. This we actually learned already. So you have to wonder why they're repeating it, but maybe because we talked about the kazayit. If you have half an olive oak of this and half an olive oak, one you have a thought of eating and one you have a thought of burning, those don't combine. And therefore it's totally fine. And now we talk about the different parts. So now we do have a kazayit, but your machshava has to do with the hide of the animal, which nobody eats. Okay, it's not edible. Or minarotev, or from the gravy, which we don't eat. Or minakipa, which is the part that gets burned on when you cook up meat. In the bottom of the pot, you put spices and stuff, and there's like sometimes you could burn the bottom of the pot, and you end up with this black stuff at the bottom that's kind of spices and the dried up stuff. That's not edible. Mina alal, different opinions what this is, okay, but perhaps it's a membrane of the animal, which we don't eat. Umina atzamot, from the bones. Umina gidim, from the sinews. Mina karnaim, from the corns. Mina tafaim, from the hooves. Okay, these are all things that are not edible. So if your pigul thought is, I'm going to eat those things that are not edible, well then, chutz zmano or chutz l'mkomo, kasher. The korban's kasher, it's not pigul. Ve'ein chayavin alehem mishum pigul v'notar v'tameh. Now this is a threesome that goes together. It's probably why they repeated the pigul. You're not chayav in them, okay, or they're also talking here now. It could be they're talking about, it's not clear, but it could be that if it was pigul and you eat these parts, and so not edible parts, remember the karet comes when you eat it. If you eat it, they're not edible parts, so you're not chayav mishum pigul. And you're not chayav mishum notal, which is if you didn't eat the animal and you left it beyond the given time, and then you ate a membrane of the animal beyond the given time, you're not chayav. Or a tamei person can't eat the korban. These are two totally different issues that we weren't talking about until now. But tamei person ate it. Also, he's not chayav karet. Usually you would be chayav karet for eating impure, eating while you're impure sacrificial meat. You're not chayav here. Because this is not meat. Okay, that would have to be meat. This is not meat, it's not edible. Hashochetet mukdashim. Okay, before we had shochetet zevach, now we're saying mukdashim. Why is it a different term? Because they're talking about female animals now. If you slaughter a female animal, le'echol shlil or shliya b'chutz, and your intent is you're going to eat either the fetus or the placenta outside, lo pigel. Okay, that's not pigul. That's the chutz l'mkomo. It's not pigul because that's not. Again, it's not really the basar of the animal. It's something secondary to it. Hamolek etatolin le'echol beitzehem b'chutz lo pigel. And similarly, if you do malika, which is the way they slaughtered birds, and with the intent that you're going to eat the eggs, which again is very similar to the fetus, outside, lo pigel. That's not pigul. But now we're switching topics. Similar topic, but switching directions. If you had a bird or an animal that actually became pigul because you had a thought, I'm going to eat the meat outside of the given time, and then you eat chalav mukdashim ubeitzei torin, you either eat the milk that came out of that animal, or you eat the eggs that came out of that animal, of a pigul animal, okay, or bird in this case, the beitzim would be from the bird, ein chayavim alehem mishum pigul v'notar v'tameh. Okay, the milk and the eggs are not considered the meat of the animal where you get chiyuv karet. If it was actually pigul, you're not going to get karet for eating those parts because those parts are not the meat of the animal. That's not called the basar. Okay, it has to be eating the animal itself and not something that came out of it, like the milk or the eggs. So now comes Rabbi Elazar, and he's going to make a statement. And what we're going to do is we're going to have 3 attempts, although it's going to be first 2, then we're going to do something else. Okay, 3, but altogether 3 attempts to prove that Rabbi Elazar is true and what he said is true from Tanaitic sources. The last source we're going to bring is our Mishnah. Okay, the first two attempts are going to be from other sources. The third one's going to be from our Mishnah, and we're going to successfully prove it. Okay, but the first two are not going to be successful proofs. And before we get to the last successful proof, and it's probably why they ended with it, is because we're going to do first a difficulty. After the first two attempts at proofs, which we're not going to succeed, we're going to bring a difficulty, reject the difficulty as well, just like we're going to reject the proofs. And then we're going to end with the one conclusive source here, which is going to prove Rabbi Elazar from our Mishnah. So let's read Rabbi Elazar and then we'll understand. Amar Rabbi Elazar. So again, he's an Amora, he's a prize student of Rabbi Yochanan. Pigel bezevach nitpagel hashlil. Now, what do we see in our Mishnah about the shlil? If you have a thought about the shlil, the fetus, that doesn't make the korban pigul. But we never talked about what if the animal is pigul, are you allowed to eat the shlil? Okay? What did we say? If the animal's pigul, then you can't eat the egg. You can eat the eggs and the milk. It didn't say you can eat the shlil. And that's going to be the final proof for really Rabbi Elazar. I'll tell you now. I wanted you to know that now because I think that will help you understand what he's basically saying. So let's read. Pigel bezevach. If the zevach became pigul, because you had a thought about eating a part of the animal that's food and turned it into pigul, right, outside of its time, then nitpagel hashlil. Then the shlil becomes pigul. Okay, remember the way this works, right? Pigel is you did the action of creating pigul, but nitpagel is it's already become pigul. So if it's pigul, then what parts are forbidden to eat? The animal itself and also the fetus. But b'shlil, if you had a thought about the shlil, I'm going to eat the shlil beyond its given time, that's not pigul that we saw in our Mishnah. Lo nitpagel hazevach. Pigel ba'alal. Okay, now we're talking about a bird. Now the alal was listed in the things that if you have a thought about it, it's not pigul because it's not edible. We said it was the membrane or maybe something else. We're not sure exactly. But in the bird, whatever that thing is, in a bird, it's actually softer and edible. So if it's a bird and you have a thought about I'm going to eat the alal beyond the given time, it's pigul. And not only that, but nitpagla mora'a, the crop. The crop is the part in the bird where they chew up all the food and it's kind of disgusting because it has all the chewed up food in it. So that part becomes pigul. And if somebody eats it, they'll get curry, even though it's disgusting. But if they do eat it, it's part of the animal, they'll get pigul. They'll get curry. But b'mora'a, since it's not really edible, most people don't eat it. If your thought was about the mora'a, then lo nitpagel alal, and then you later eat the alal, that's not pigul. In other words, there's no pigul if your thought is about the mora'a. What this is basically saying, we're going to see this with one more case in a minute, he gives 3 cases where you could have something that a thought about it, because it's not really edible, is not going to make the animal pigul, and the rest of the meat pigul. But if the animal actually becomes pigul for an appropriate reason, right, for a way that could be pigul, this part, if it were eaten, okay, then you would actually be obligated. You would get karet for it. That's the basic direction. The third case is a little bit different. Third case is talking about the parima nisrafim. It's the same idea, but it's a different kind of idea because it's not edible, not edible. It's does it get eaten or not get, well, we're going to see. It doesn't really get eaten. So what are we talking about? There's parima nisrafim and there's also seirima nisrafim. I'll talk about them both because later we're going to talk about them both, even though right now we're just talking about the parim, but it would be true for the seir also. There's parim and seirim, that's bulls and goats, that are nisrafim, that get burned. Don't confuse nisrafim with muktarim, burnt on the altar. These get burnt not only somewhere else, outside Jerusalem, in a place called the Beit HaDeshen. So the way you bring these animals, okay, let's just talk about which they are. Par Helen Davar Shel Tzibor, which we know from Horayot. The Par Kohen HaMashiach, these are the sin offerings that we bring for the majority of the people, followed an erroneous ruling of the court, or the Kohen Gadol followed his own erroneous ruling, or the par of the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur. All these are done in a unique way, which we've talked about before, but we didn't really talk about the fact that they're burned. What we do is, first of all, we sprinkle the blood inside the heichal, either on the altar, also on the parochet, that's the achad achavashtayim, right? Either in front of the parochet, on the parochet. Okay? The blood is brought on the inside, in the inner sanctuary, and then the animal is taken out and is burned outside Jerusalem. It doesn't go on the altar at all. Okay, the blood goes on the inner altar, not the outer altar. Most korbanot, the blood goes on the outer altar, and the animal gets burned outside. burn nisrafim. Now the language of pigul is achila, or we took achila to be also haktara, burned on the altar. But it's not talking about this part which gets burned, a fire, we make a fire outside. That's not haktara. It's not part of achila. So now the third he says is pigel. Now there is some part of that goes on the altar. What is that? The imurim. Imurim are the parts of every sacrifice gets burned on the altar. Okay, let's just go through again. This is just good background about korbanot. Korban ola, the entire animal gets burnt on the altar. Okay, just the hide comes off of the animal. Everything else gets burned. But in all other korbanot, usually the imurim get burned, and the rest of the animal is given, depending on which one, koche kochim go to the kohanim to eat, kochim kalim, like shlamim, todel, goes to the owners to eat, and they can share with other people. Korban pesach, those get eaten by the people. Now, the imurim are these certain parts. Okay, there's the chelev ala kerev, which is the one that covers the stomach, the lining of the stomach. There's ones that cover other parts of the stomach. There's yoteret hakaveh, which is the lobe of the liver. There's the klayot, the kidneys, and the fat around the kidneys. So these fatty areas and certain parts get burned on the altar of every sacrifice. Even the parim and nisrafim and the sirim and nisrafim. So, if you have a pigul machshava about burning the imurim outside the given time, that will be pigul. What happens to the meat of the animal then? If you eat the meat of the animal, which normally is supposed to get burned outside, it's not really supposed to be eaten, but pigel be'imurim nitpaglu parim. That the meat of that animal becomes pigul, even though they're supposed to be burned outside and not eaten, but it doesn't matter. Like, that's the meat of the animal. So if you had a thought about the imurim, the parim will be pigul. But, right, meaning, if you eat them, you'll get karet. But if you have a machshava beparim, lo nitpaglu imurim. Why not? Because a thought about the parim is either going to be, right, a thought to eat them or a thought to burn them on the altar. Now, they're not ru'yim la'achila, they're not ru'yim la'ktara, because they get nisrafim. Now, it's burn, but it's a different kind of burning. That's not included in the words ha'achol ya'achel. So it's not pigul. So if you had a thought that I'm going to burn the animals tomorrow, or burn them outside the place where I'm supposed to burn them, korban's not disqualified. Okay, so again, it's another one that goes in different directions, right? That can't make it pigul, but it can become pigul if it was done, from some other reason. So now we want to try to bring proofs, like I said. 3 proofs, although we're going to start with 2 proofs, 1 rejection, and then another proof. Lema Meseyale. Let's suggest that this can support what he said. Vishavim. Okay, this is a machloket, Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, about whether the parim and nisrafim even have laws of pigul apply to them. Rabbi Shimon says there's no laws of pigul that apply at all. Okay, forget about, not only just a thought about, even if you have thought about the imurim, it's not going to be pigul. Why? Because he says pigul comes up in the pasuk about shlamim. And shlamim, it has to be similar to shlamim that it's brought on the outer altar. And this is brought on the inner altar. It's not similar at all to shlamim. But he agrees with the rabbis who think there is pigul by the parim and nisrafim, but they both agree, she'im chishev ba'achilat parim ub'sreifatam lo asav lo klum. Even the rabbis who think there is pigul agree, though, that if the thought was to eat the par, okay, which it doesn't get eaten, or to burn the bull, which it doesn't get, right, that's not haktara, outside the time or outside the place, lo asav lo klum. That's not going to be pigul, because again, that's what I said before. Now, my love, doesn't this infer, though, what we're looking for, which Rabbi Lazar says, which is what? Ha-chishev be'imurim, but if you were chishev on the imurim, which do get burned on the altar, and you thought, I'm going to burn these tomorrow, nitpaglu parim, that the parim would be pigul. And that's exactly Rabbi Elazar. To which they say, no, you can't necessarily derive this. And with this we move to Amud lo. Ha-chishev be'imurim, nitpaglu miurim atzman. You could say, no, not like Rabbi Elazar said, you could have a thought about the imurim and the parim will be pigul. No. You could say, and what would be the counter to Rabbi Elazar? That if you have a thought about imurim, the imurim are pigul, but not the parim, because the parim can't create pigul, so they also don't become pigul. Likewise, the crop. The crop can create a pigul situation, so a thought about something else wouldn't make the crop pigul if you ate it. Right? That would be the counter. So this could say the opposite, in which case this doesn't prove anything. Tashma, because this is just an inference, you can infer something else. Tashma, next source. This is the Mishnah in Me'ilah. Parim anisrafim usirim anisrafim. Here come the sirim. Oh, I didn't tell you what the sirim are, by the way. I forgot. The sirim are goats that get burned outside. What are they? So the seir for avodah zara, if the tzibur, remember, worships avodah zara, chatat for avodah zara, you add an additional seir besides the par, helim davar shel tzibur, and the seir on Yom Kippur. Remember, there's two seirim, one gets thrown l'Azazel, and the other one gets brought in the temple. But it also gets burned outside, okay? Just like the parim. So mo'alim, okay, now we're going to talk about different stages of sanctity of this and what will be. Most of this is irrelevant, but one point is going to be relevant. Mo'alim mehem mishu hukdeshu. At what point do they become sanctified? That there's the laws of me'ilah, which is misuse of consecrated property. As soon as I designate the seir or the par for this korban, the animal's still alive, right? If somebody uses it, for some personal reason, that's me'ilah. Nishchitu, once they're slaughtered, now an animal, when it's alive, can never become susceptible to impurity. So once it's slaughtered, then it becomes food, basically, and food is susceptible to impurity. So it can be disqualified already by someone who, first of all, definitely a tameh, but they don't even mention that, but someone who even went to the mikveh that morning and is waiting for the sunset, or hasn't brought their korbanot yet, because that's what we learned just before, right? You're not allowed to touch kodashim if you're impure, right, when you're a mechusar kibburim until you bring your korbanot. Ubilina. And also, this is the key line for us, if you leave it overnight. In other words, the day you slaughter it, that's the day you have to burn it. If you leave it overnight and don't burn it till the next day, it's a problem. It becomes disqualified. Now, they make this jump, and they say the following. Two jumps. My lovely napasar. Don't we mean the meat, right? Because we're talking about the par being burned, right? The meat itself. Because also there's the imurim, right? That will also get disqualified at lina. So, are we not talking about the meat? And if we're talking about the meat, ushmamina, and then we have to make another jump. Migo de pasla belina, pasla b'machshava. Since it can be disqualified, time is a factor, leaving it overnight till the next day. Then a psul of machshava should be relevant there, meaning I have a thought that I'm going to leave it overnight, right, while I'm slaughtering it, let's say. That would ruin it as well, because since leaving it overnight would disqualify it, so a thought about leaving it overnight would also disqualify it. In which case, what do you see here? That would prove Rabbi Elazar. Because a thought, right, if it becomes a thought of machshava, could disqualify the meat. So it would have to be really a thought of machshava about the imurim, but it could disqualify the meat as well. To which they say, no. Who says they're talking about the meat? Maybe it's all talking about the imurim itself, which are the ones that have to be brought on the altar. Maybe pigul is only relevant for the imurim on all sides, both what makes a pigul and also what becomes pigul if it was messed up. So lowly, not imurim, and that's what it's talking about, not the basar. So now they try to make another push to say, no, it's not talking about the imurim only, it's talking about the basar. How do we know? Hamidi katane sefer, because look at the end of that Mishnah. Kulam mo'alim behem al beit hadeshen ad shu tacha basar. The me'ilah kicks in when you sanctify the animal from the beginning, when you say, I'm designating this animal. But when does it end? When it's on the Beit Hadeshen, the fire where it's burning. Still, if you took it off, let's say, and used it for something else at that point, it would be a problem. Let's say you take it off and eat it. Okay? Until what point? Until it's completely charred. Okay? Where it's like, like coals. It's just black. Completely. So now, that part is talking about the meat. So, Michlal Dereisha Linat Basal. From there, you can infer that also the earlier part must have been talking about the meat, and then that would prove our point. If you made a pigul, which would obviously only be a thought about the imurim, then the meat itself would also become pigul. In other words, again, that was all because of this word lina. It's disqualified by time, which means even a machshava about time could disqualify the meat as well. To which the Gemara rejects and says, no, just because the end part was talking about the basar, could be this part talking about imurim. Midiria, hakadita v'hakadita, each one relevant to its context. Reisha imurim v'seifa basar. And then it doesn't teach us anything, because that inference you made that's talking about the meat isn't necessarily accurate. Because the end is talking about meat, but the beginning could be talking about the imurim, the parts that get burned on the altar, and only pigul is only relevant for them, both the thought of pigul and the consequence of this becomes pigul. Doesn't prove. So that was two sources to try to prove Rabbi Elazar. Now we're moving on to the difficulty. Mativ Rabba. Ve'elu she'em mefaglim ve'em mitpagim. I want you to remember this line because we're going to repeat it. Okay? So these are things that don't create a pigul situation and don't become pigul if, remember, if you eat it, you're not going to get karet for it, even if the animal's actually pigul, because it's not food. So what's that? Semer sheberashek vasim, v'se'ar shebizkanat the wool on the sheep, the beard of the goats, va'or, va'arote, va'kippah. Okay, these are the things we saw before: the hide, the gravy, the charred stuff, the black stuff at the bottom, the alal, the mor'ah, right, the membrane, the crop, ha'atzamot, the bones, the gidim, the sinews, hakarnaim, the horns, tzlafaim, the hooves. V'shlil, v'shiliyah. Notice what's here: the shlil and the shiliyah. Okay, the embryo and the placenta. V'chalav ha'muktashim u'beitzei torin, the milk and the eggs. Kulan lo mefaglim v'lo mitpagim. Now here it says they don't become pigul either. That goes against Rabbi Elazar. That seems pretty clear. If the animal's pigul and you eat them, you're not going to be chayav pigul. If the meat's left over, you're not going to be chayav nota for it. You're not going to be chayav tameh if you ate it. And if you offer them up on the altar, on an altar outside the temple, you're actually exempt because these aren't parts that get offered on the altar. They're not edible parts at all. My lav. Now, doesn't this mean lo mifaglim azevach lo mitpaglim machmat zevach? Right, the same way we understood. They can't create a pigul situation in a korban, nor if the korban became for some other reason pigul, you wouldn't be chayav for eating them. So they say, and then that would go against Rabbi Elazar. They say, no. Read it differently. Lo mifaglim et hazevach v'lo mitpagim machmat atzman. If you were to have a pigul thought on eating this part, since it's not edible, right, then it's not pigul. And if you then go eat the part, you're not chayav mishum pigul. Okay? And it's if it were pigul on its own. But if it was pigul because something else was pigul, then maybe it would be forbidden to eat, and that fits with Rabbi Elazar. So the Gemara says, which was repeated twice, first line and then in the middle. Why is it added if not to say it doesn't become pigul in both situations? Right? You can eat the meat. No matter what, it's not karet, whether it was pigul for some other reason or pigul on its own. So they say, no, the fact that it repeats it doesn't teach you anything, because look, why did you add, right? It says pigul 3 times there. And then it also says you're not chayav mishum pigul if you eat it. That already was said in the mitpagim and the mitpagim. So why does that repeated? Well, there, it just repeated it because it wanted to get to notar and tameh. Those 3 often go together, so it added pigul there. That's the 3rd time it's mentioned. So the 2nd time also, we'll say it's not really there for any real reason. It's just because it wanted to get to the line. If you offer them outside, so it also went back and just started repeating laws. And it said, okay, let's just repeat. And now we're kind of reviewing a whole bunch of laws and adding some new ones. So don't take that too seriously, and it doesn't necessarily mean that. So this doesn't necessarily contradict Rabbi Elazar. Now we come to the definitive proof. Rava Amar. We can learn it from our Mishnah, a derivation from our Mishnah. And then, so it says, right, if you have thought about shlil, shiliyah, and all these others, there's no pigul. And then it says, Now notice what it said. If the animal or the bird becomes pigul, and then you eat the milk or the eggs, there's no pigul. But what doesn't it say there? It doesn't say if the animal becomes pigul and you eat the fetus, there's no pigul. So what do you see here? Right? Hashliv v'shaliyah, you'd be chayavim, you'd be obligated. Elalav shmamina, kamach matazevach, kamach matatzman shmamina. So it must be that the earlier line in the Mishnah is talking about the thought about the shlil. But the second line, which omits that, is talking about if it became pigul for some other reason, right? Then you actually would be forbidden to eat the shlil, and that actually proves conclusively what Rabbi Elazar said. Now, because we brought this Mishnah about ma'alem mehen patur, and this is really just because of that one line that really wasn't there for our purposes, but because of that, they're going to bring this whole other sugya, and that will bring us to the next Mishnah, and we'll end there for today. So now we quote a Mishnah in Zevachim Pedalet about a totally different issue, ba'alei mumim. Now, if you put a blemished animal on the altar, you have to take it down. It doesn't belong on the altar, a blemished animal. Rabbi Akiva says no, you shouldn't put it on the altar, but if you put it on, it's already on, you don't take it off. Remember we had that whole thing about things that already go on, you don't necessarily take them off. So, Tnanatam, Ba'alei Mumim, Rabbi Akiva Machshir Ba'alei Mumim. He says if you already put it on the altar, leave it there. Rabbi Chia Bar Abba, we're now going to have 3 limitations, and our question from that bright is going to be on the 3rd limitation. So limitation number 1, Rabbi Chia Bar Abba says, Rabbi Yochanan, Lo Chshir Rabbi Akiva Ela B'dukin Sheba'ayin, Hu'il Ksherim Ba'ofot. He wasn't talking about all blemishes. He was talking about this issue with the eye. There's different, some people think cataracts, some people think some problem with the cornea, some people think it's different opinions. But it's something that in a bird is not a blemish. So in an animal, if it went on the altar, it's not so bad. We leave it. Second, it's only if first you sanctified it, then it got a blemish. If it was blemished before you even sanctified the animal and designated it for a sacrifice, of course this doesn't work. There's something else, we'll get rid of these next words. And he agrees with a female animal that you designate for an ola, which you can't bring an ola from a female animal. That's like and you wouldn't leave it on the altar. You would take it off right away. Because it's basically something disqualified from the beginning, and then you sanctified it. Well, it's not sanctified at all. So you would take it off. Now, Mativ Rabbi Zera says, Hama'alemehem patul. If you put the shliel, that fetus, on the altar, you'd be exempt. Hami iman sounds like, but if you put meat of the mother, you'd be chayav, right? Yeah. If you brought it outside. Why? Because anything that's supposed to go on the altar can't be brought outside on an altar. Now, wait. In a female animal, all the parts of the body don't get burned on the altar unless it's an ola. So this must be referring to an ola because they're talking about the rest of the body, right? All the meat of the mother. And again, this is an inference. If you put the fetus outside, you're exempt, but from the mother, anything that you would put outside, you'd be liable for because it's supposed to be burned on the altar. That's only going to be in a korban ola, and we're talking about a female animal. So that makes it sound like the female animal is supposed to be, if you put it on the altar, it's supposed to stay on the altar. In other words, it makes it sound like it can't be brought outside because it's ra'oi, theoretically, could go on the altar. That's only Rabbi Akiva. If you say the female animal, the ola could go on the altar. So hechi mishkachala, right? The only place you would have this is ba'olat nekeva, because it would have to be female if you're talking about a fetus and its mother. And it would the only way the meat is supposed to be on the altar would be according to Rabbi Akiva, basically. So, if you, Rabbi Akiva, were to say, which is against what we said, he said, that the Ola Nekeva, once you put it on the altar, it actually stays. That's why it's disqualified if you do it outside. And therefore, Hamani, this would be Rabbi Akiva. But if you say, if it went on, it has to come off, then this fits with nobody's opinion. So, Ema, say it like this, a different inference. Right, if you put the fetus, but hami imurei iman chayav. But if you put the imurim of the mother, you'd be obligated. And then it could be referring to any korban, not the ola, and then we're good. But what's the problem? Well, it has to be two parallel things. Ham mehen katane v'iman dumi yeditu. You could put the fetus, and right, that's okay. But if you put the mother parallel to the fetus, right, dumia ditu, same, which would be everything of the mother, which would then go back to our problem. So they say, change it. It would have to be if you take from the imurim of the fetus, you'd be patur, which would then infer the imurim of the mother, you'd be chayav, and that would take it out of the whole story of olat nekeva, and then we're okay, because then it doesn't contradict this limitation we gave to what Rabbi Akiva said. Okay, with that we finished for today. So what did we do? 3 basic sections. We talked about the machloket, about the pokeking, why they were poking the Azara. We had questions on each opinion. From there we moved to the deep down into pigul, which cases are exceptions to the rule. Things, mainly we talked about things that are inedible, and then we got to Rabbi Elazar, who says, even though you can't make a pigul situation from these items, like a shliel, or the mora'ah, or the parim hanisrafim, but if it became pigul otherwise, those things would be forbidden with kari. We brought 3 sources to try to prove it. In the end, we got it from an inference from our Mishnah. That was the only successful thing we did. And we tried to reject it from another source, and that didn't work. And then from that 3rd source that we used to reject, the one source we used to reject, but it was the 3rd source we brought, there was this braita, and it had this one line. We bring some other sugya that relates to that one line, kind of raises a difficulty with this opinion of Rabbi Akiva that you could put Baalei Mumim if they went on, they don't have to come down. 3 limitations on it. That 3rd limitation we questioned from the Braita and resolved it. And with that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov.